Evelyn, the little girl, locked up in silence for 13 years. What happens to a child who is deprived of basic love, interaction, and human care for most of his or her life? What if, for years, they were trapped in a silent world, unable to speak or move freely, without even knowing what it means to feel safe or loved? The story of Evelyn Walker is one of the most tragic and heartbreaking tales of human abuse and neglect ever recorded. A story of how isolation can destroy a life before it even begins. In the fall of 1970, a young girl named Evelyn with her mother entered a social services office in Harmony, California. At first glance, she appeared to be a child with severe disabilities, perhaps around 6 or 7 years old, struggling to make sounds, barely able to walk, and showing signs of what looked like autism. But the truth was much darker than anyone could have imagined. This girl, who was presumed to be 6 years old, was actually 13 years old, and what appeared to be a neurological condition was simply the result of an unimaginable life of confinement and abuse. Her real name, Walker Evelyn, was a pseudonym given to her by social workers, a name that would later become the symbol of her years of suffering. An Evelyn locked in a bottle, unable to escape the darkness that had consumed her life for over a decade. Evelyn's condition was immediately alarming. A medical examination revealed that she was severely malnourished, her body twisted and broken by years of neglect. His hips were deformed, his stomach swollen, and his skin showed signs of horrible scarring. One particular feature that stood out was a large black callosity on her buttocks and thighs, a sign that she had been sitting in her own garbage, immobilized by years of forced confinement. She was incontinent, had no control over her body, and seemed completely unable to connect with others, avoiding any human contact as if she had forgotten what it meant to be hugged or comforted. It was just that Evelyn had never known kindness. It was that she had been trapped in a world that didn't allow her the basic experiences needed to become the person she could have been. As police and social services began to piece together his story, the true extent of his suffering began to unfold. The chain of events that led to this horror dates back years, even before Evelyn was born. Her parents, James and Madison Y., had a deeply troubled relationship from the beginning. James was possessive, violent, and paranoid, traits that would only get worse over time. The couple's life became a prison in its own right, where every movement, every decision, was dictated by James's control. When Madison became pregnant, her life became even more limited. James's possessiveness became unbearable, and Madison found herself in a constant battle for her own sense of self. He beat her during pregnancy, causing serious injuries that sent her to the hospital. It was there, recovering from these injuries, that she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. But instead of bringing joy, the baby's arrival seemed to intensify James' need to control and isolate. From the beginning, Madison and James's house has been ruled by silence. James hated noise, and anything that could disturb the peace was forbidden. When their first child cried, he was furious. As a child, she was locked in the garage for several days, where she contracted pneumonia and died. A second son followed, but died shortly after birth due to a rare blood disorder. But the birth of their third child, Logan, seemed to offer a glimmer of hope, until he too was neglected, his development delayed and his health jeopardized by a lack of proper care. Eventually, in desperation, James's mother intervened, bringing Logan to live with her in an attempt to help her. This surgery, however, only deepened the division between James and Madison. James's devotion to his mother and her overpowering devotion to him left Madison isolated and helpless. When Evelyn was born in 1957, her first 20 months seemed relatively normal. She had probably been neglected, but at least she was still confined to the hellish isolation that would come later. That all changed, however, in December 1958. James's mother, his only confidant and protector, was tragically killed in an accident. For James, this event destroyed his already fragile mind. His paranoia grew to monstrous proportions, and he became obsessed with protecting his family from the outside world. He moved his family into his late mother's house, a place that had once been a shrine, but has now become a prison. The house had 2 bedrooms. One was preserved as a shrine for James's mother, intact and sacred. The other, the one where Evelyn was imprisoned, was stripped of all comforts. James and Madison confined themselves to the living room, with Logan sleeping on the floor, while James held a gun in his lap, ready to defend his family from any perceived threat. The house became a fortress of fear. At first, Evelyn was allowed to play in the garden or stay in a small children's enclosure, but as James's paranoia grew, his world shrank. Soon she was confined to a single room, closed away from the outside world. This room, barely furnished, was lifeless, only a wardrobe, a crib, and a potty. James even built a harness that tied Evelyn naked to a chair, her arms and legs tied so she couldn't move or touch her own body. Her bed, a crib that served as a cage, was equipped with wire mesh to prevent her from escaping. The windows were darkened to block out the light, and the door was always closed, leaving her in total darkness most of the time. Madison, who was allowed to interact little with her daughter, could do nothing to intervene. Evelyn's only experience with the outside world was the violent punishment she received if she made a sound. The act of eating was also a traumatic experience, with food stuffed into her mouth carelessly, often force-fed, and smeared on her face if she refused. Evelyn's existence became a total deprivation. No affection, no stimulation, no human connection. Just the cold, oppressive silence of a world where she was invisible. This has been going on for years. The world outside has moved on, but in Evelyn's world, time has stopped. He never learned to walk properly, talk, or interact with people. Its development has been stunted in every way imaginable. The world had been closed to her. Her senses had been blurred, her body neglected, her mind trapped in a state of complete isolation. Until 1970, when a violent argument between Madison and James finally broke the silence, that Evelyn's nightmare would be over. For the first time in years, Madison asked for help. He contacted her parents, and it was they who, with the help of the authorities, managed to bring Evelyn out of the darkness. When Evelyn was admitted to social services, the extent of her deprivation was impossible to ignore. His condition was disconcerting. He could not speak, but he could imitate sounds. He couldn't walk without difficulty. He moved strangely, almost like a rabbit, as if his body had forgotten the natural way of functioning. She could not chew her food properly, and her physical appearance showed the long-term effects of extreme malnutrition and neglect. The damage to his body and mind was profound, and the world began to take notice. Linguists studied his case, trying to determine if it was possible for a child who had been deprived of language during the critical developmental years to acquire it completely. Unfortunately, despite some progress, Evelyn never achieved full language mastery. His ability to communicate had been limited by the years of isolation he had endured. However, even though Evelyn has been freed from the shackles of her father's tyranny, her life has not improved in a lasting way. She was placed in foster care, but even these were violent, and the damage done to her psyche continued to grow. His story, a story of unimaginable suffering, has become a case study on the limits of human resilience. Despite her efforts to help her, Evelyn's life never really healed. In the years that followed, his name disappeared from the public eye. Evelyn's last known account dates back to 2011, and while there have been reports that she was still receiving state assistance, all information about her current life is sealed. His tragic story, one of the darkest examples of child abuse in modern history, remains a painful reminder of what can happen when a child is deprived of the basic human connections that are essential for survival. Evelyn's life is a clear example of the devastating consequences of isolation and abandonment. She was robbed of her childhood, her voice, and her humanity. But in the process, she has become a symbol of resilience and the horrific potential of human cruelty. It's a story that challenges us to think about the very nature of care, connection, and what it means to be human. That said, thank you and see you next time.